Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Hartman, and I'm Director of Education at Bard on the Beach Shakespeare Festival. I am delighted to welcome you to this final segment of our Bard Explored series. For more than a decade, we offered the Bard Explored series as part of our Shakespeare Festival. In an ordinary year, right around now, our site and production teams would be in the midst of what we call strike, dismantling all of the production elements, taking down our tents and storing everything until next season. We're so grateful to offer our festival in a magnificent place called Snock. On the waterfront in the heart of what we now call Vancouver, Snock has been a rich, vibrant, and has a very rich, vibrant, and very long history as a place of gathering and storytelling. Right now, of course, we must content ourselves with gathering in this virtual space, but we are still gathering, and that is a powerful thing. We're all tuning in from somewhere, so I would like to invite you to take a moment, wherever you are, to appreciate that place, to appreciate the history, the culture, and the spirit of that place, and your connection to it. We at Bard on the Beach are on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of Bard's 2021 season, the Peter and Joanne Brown Foundation and BMO. And I'd also like to thank the sponsor of the Bard Explored series, the Office of the President of Simon Fraser University. Now, many of you know that we've offered the Bard Explored series as part of our festival for more than a decade. And so you've been enjoying the fantastic work of Simon Fraser University's Dr. Paul Boudra. It has been such a pleasure collaborating with Paul on this over the years, hearing his insights, delighting in his wit, and enjoying those Saturday mornings with our Bard Explored patrons. It's been one of the silver linings of this pandemic and this time that we're in, a time of adaptation and a time of figuring things out, that we found a new format for Bard Explored. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this series. As much as we delight in Paul talking on his own, it's hard to imagine doing that over Zoom. So doing these conversations has given us a chance to enjoy Paul's insights and also hear the insights and ideas of a lot of other scholars that we wouldn't normally be able to welcome to our site. So I am thrilled to turn this over to Paul. I will be back at the end to help with the Q&A. And in the meantime, everyone listening, please feel free to use the Q&A function at any time. Throw your questions in there and we will address them at the end. Paul, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you and welcome to everyone who's watching us on Zoom. It's my great pleasure to introduce today Professor Paul Yachnin. Paul did his PhD at the University of Toronto. He took up a professorship at UBC briefly before moving to McGill, where he is now the Tomlinson Professor of Shakespeare Studies. Dr. Yachnin has published some 8 books, and he has 2 books coming out next year, which seems slightly excessive. One of those, Making Publics in Shakespeare's Playhouse, I think is of special interest because Paul has done a lot of work on the idea of making the public in early modern Europe. Paul has edited editions of Shakespeare's The Tempest and Richard II. He led an international team of scholars to study the idea of conversion, religious, political, and other, in the early modern period. He has served as the president of the Shakespeare Association of America. And finally, in the spirit of full disclosure, I should mention that Paul and I are old friends. We were actually in graduate school together some 6 years ago. So, Paul, welcome to Bard on the Beach.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's delightful to be here with you. Thank you to Mary for that great introduction as well to the event. And let me share with you also that Paul and I go back a very long time, 6 or 7 years at least. And it means that not only do we know each other for a long time, but we spent a lot of time with Shakespeare, and so my sense of, who Shakespeare is this guy who lives in my house. And he's been living in my house for years. And he's an interesting person. Sometimes he says things like, I just can't believe what he just said.
Mm-hmm.
So, in Merchant of Venice, when Antonio says to Bassanio, he says something like, you might as well try to soften the hardest thing in the world as soften his Jewish heart.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Jewish. And I remember hearing that line spoken in a production with F. Murray Abraham as Shylock in New York. And I've been kind of teaching the play and thinking about the play as a play that wasn't anti-Semitic, but a play that put anti-Semitism on trial. And suddenly I realized that, no, that was wrong. The play had a full dose of anti-Semitism, and it was right there. And, and the thing is that I said, William, how could you say that? And the key for me is to stay in the conversation with him. Don't just push him away when he says something like that, or when in, what's that play, Titus Andronicus, they say the most ghastly things about a little Black infant in arms.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I said, how could you say that? And he said, well, we're living in a racist culture, man. We're living in an anti-Semitic culture. But I stayed in the conversation with him. And that, for me, is absolutely key to working through the kinds of prejudices and those fears and those hatreds that he had in his own time. And I guess some of us still have in our time.
Which really brings me to my first question. And this is a question I've posed to all of the people that we've been speaking to in this series. And you're the first Canadian that we've spoken to in this series. So I'm really interested in getting a Canadian perspective on this. Yeah. And the question, it really comes out of the movie that Bard produced, Done Undone, written by Kate Besworth. And it asks this big question. Is Shakespeare still relevant? Should we still be performing the plays of the archetypal dead white male some 450 years after his heyday and playing them so often? And if we do perform them, how should we perform them in, say, a Canadian context?
That's great. That's such an important question. I think we keep him with us because he is a dead white male. He's dead. But the things he wrote are vitally alive. And they're alive in the theater. They're alive with people like us. They're alive with the artists who take up Shakespeare and rewrite him. And there's so much of that going on now. So I think it's about staying in the conversation with him, because the world that he lived in, it's still the world we're living in now. he's writing, we talked about this before, but let me just bring it forward again. Mm-hmm. And it speaks also to a question that is of vital interest and importance for us now in Canada. He's writing, it's about a century since the beginning of the conquest and the cultural genocide in what came to be called the Americas. And he reader about the conquest. Of course, he's reading Bartolomé de las Casas on the Spanish conquest and the inhuman behavior of the Spanish. But it's not just the Spanish, of course, the English are there too by the time he's working. And he's reading Montaigne on the cannibals. And he writes a play very early in his career called Taming of the Shrew, which seems to have nothing to do with Canada. But it's really interesting. He's living in a time that sees conversion being weaponized in the Americas, in England itself, on the continent, where rulers are using that they can use religious conversion as a weapon against not only people's bodies, but against their minds and their souls. Mm-hmm. And in the play, Kate, who is described as a devil, as some kind of wild animal, is taken off to this place that Tranio himself calls the taming school. And she's not beaten there. She's not killed like so many of the children that we're hearing about now, but she is, she's starved. She's not allowed to eat. She's not allowed to sleep. And sleep deprivation is a classic form of torture. Mm-hmm. And she's constantly harangued until she agrees to convert to wifely obedience. So the play is a kind of resituating in a domestic framework of the very kinds of things that were going on in Shakespeare's own England, but more so on the continent of Europe and more still so in the Americas. And at the end of the play, she has this long speech, which is very difficult to teach and very difficult to perform, in which she swears that she is now an obedient wife and that women, the weaker sex, owe their husbands their true obedience. But the wonderful thing about Shakespeare's play, and this goes right across the plays that he wrote and the characters that he created, we come face to face with someone whose inward mental and emotional life is not visible to us. We do not know if she really means what she is saying, whether she's saying it just to survive, whether she's saying it with deep irony. And so we come face to face with somebody we can call a real person. And what Shakespeare builds on the story of forced conversion is also the figure of a character who is someone just like us. So Shakespeare is not only representing the world that he lived in a way that maps onto the world that we're living in, he is also creating people that look like us, that are human beings where we recognize their fundamental humanity. This goes for a character like Kate at the beginning of Shakespeare's career, and it goes for a character like Caliban, who's also the victim of forced conversion at the very end of his career. So I think, he's dead, but his art is alive, and it still speaks to us now.
It's really interesting the way you sort of trace this idea of conversion. Of course, the other big conversion is at the end of Merchant of Venice, which so many directors of productions I've seen recently actually end up staging. They actually show Shylock, having to, accept the Christian faith, and it's horrendous. It's horrifying, and tracing that onto the problems that Canada's had with First Nations people and the residential schools. So. The last part of the first question I asked was, how do we perform these plays now? Do you think we should contextualize the stuff that is racist and sexist, alter them in performance, which is being done a lot, lines are being changed, swap it out, or some way draw attention to the relevance of those ideas now? And if so, how do we do that?
I think it's a really good question, and it's one of the hardest questions. Recent Globe production of Love's Labour's Lost, there's a long exchange among the men in the play about one of the women who seems to be a Black woman, although it's only very recently that scholars have allowed the possibility that she's a Black woman, although the text is remarkably clear that she's a Black woman. And it's full of racist denigration of her and also defense. And you can see why in the Globe production, they cut out most of it. I think that, and I'm not a theater person, but boy, it's tough enough in the classroom to deal with these passages. It's much tougher in the theater. But I think if we want to stay in the conversation with Shakespeare, because he's a way of working through our fear and our hatred and our prejudice, because he's working through those things also, then we have to play the problems. And there are moments like when Benedict says in Much Ado, if I don't love her, I'm a very Jew. That's never played in performance because it's just like tossed off, but it's integral to the thinking about what love conversion is in the play in a historical sense. And it's very, very difficult to make that clear in that moment. So I think there's no easy answer to the question. It's a really great question. I think the basic idea is that you stay in the conversation by playing the problems. And you take your time with it. You might want to put that in the program, trigger warnings, but also something about how Shakespeare is helping us work through our fears. I think that a lot of people that I talk to, and I think it goes for me also for most of my younger life, thought that we were living at a time and we could look back on the past and say, well, we're not like that anymore. Mm-hmm. And I've come to understand, and maybe Trump's election in 2016 was a big part of that. No, we're still living in the world that Shakespeare lived in. So I think that playing the problems, such as we encounter in Othello, or in Titus, or in actually all of the plays, that's the way we go. You always have to be thoughtful about it. I think you have to decelerate at those moments in performance. You have to, in some ways, prime the audience to think with Shakespeare about these difficult things. But that's as far as I can go. It's going to be a case by case thinking through the problem, but I think you play the problems, you don't ignore them.
Interesting. You mentioned language, like you're saying, I'm a very Jew. Else, Falstaff says the same thing.
Yep.
If I'm a Jew, I'm a Hebrew Jew, and basically it means I'm a monkey's uncle, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But we have to deal with that thoughtfully, like you say in the theater. Now, when we talk about theater, we're thinking about audiences, and you've done a lot of work on this idea of the public and the forming of the public. And maybe you could just sort of explain what you sort of mean by that and how Shakespeare's theater played into the construction of the idea of a public out there that has to be addressed and communicated with. And is it a homogeneous group? Is it a heterogeneous group? What do you mean by this?
Here's what I think happens in Shakespeare's England. When Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558, a year later, she does this royal proclamation and circulates to the whole country, and it says, no more plays for ordinary people. No more plays about politics or religion for ordinary people. And it's very clear about that. And she's threatening penalties against civic officials who allow plays for ordinary people about politics and religion. And you understand why she's doing that, because the high-ranking members of the country in the years leading up to her accession used players as ways of pushing their particular political and religious views. So she wants to settle everything down. She wants to kind of bring in some kind of order and peace in a country. And then Shakespeare's company and the other company and a few other acting companies, they go commercial several decades later. And what they do over and over again is they address matters of politics and religion for ordinary people, for commoners. And I think because they are commoners and the players are just players, nobody seems to care. Nobody in a position of authority seems to care. Even when Richard II is staged on the eve of the Essex Rebellion, the players don't get in trouble, even though Essex has his head cut off. So I think that one of the things that's going on, which is really interesting in the period, is ordinary people pay a penny to get together and to think with the actors about when it is right to depose a king who is a bad king, even though he is apparently designated by God as their ruler. Mm-hmm. So there are these playful publics being formed really below the radar of those with power, because who cares about what ordinary people are doing when they're hanging out at the theater? It's just a playhouse. It's called the Playhouse. And what's happening is ordinary people are beginning to develop really extraordinary skills as political analysts. And Richard II is a great play to show how this works, because Shakespeare designs it. So the first scene, as my student said last week, she couldn't figure it out. And I said, that's what he wanted. What the heck's going on in that first scene? It's only when you get to the second scene and John of Gaunt tells the widow of Thomas of Woodstock, the king is actually responsible for the death of your husband. And so the audience at Shakespeare's theater is going to have to look back at that first scene, and they suddenly realize everything that was said in that first scene were lies. Mm-hmm. It was a proxy attack on the king by Bolingbroke and his father. Everything was a lie. They were all faking it. And that kind of teaching of political expertise and political insight runs throughout the whole play. So Shakespeare is teaching ordinary people how to think insightfully and critically about the kinds of things that people in power say, even when they're dressed up in their crowns and their robes. So I think one of the things that's going on is that the practices of playgoing, of drawing people together and inviting them to think together about questions of the state, of religion, and questions, of course, about race, questions about the humanity of women. All of these are creating an informed public where there was no public before. And I think Shakespeare has some responsibility for what happens mid-century, which is a civil war and the capture, arrest, trial, and execution of the King of England. So there's good reasons for keeping Shakespeare alive in our theater. Of course, he's gone very upmarket, but I think that there's still this tremendous power to speak to regular people. And the Bard is doing so much of that. We're doing it now. Mm-hmm. I think it's so important to think with Shakespeare about, Richard III is this great play that undertakes to inoculate people against the extraordinary charm of tyrants, because Richard is hugely charming. Mm-hmm. We love him. Mm-hmm. So I think if many of our sisters and brothers in the United States spend time with Richard III, they might think again about what's his name, Donald. Donald.
Let's give Richard III a blonde wig and a red tie.
That's right.
And put him on the stage. Really interesting. And way back at the beginning of your career, you wrote an article called The Powerless Theater, in which you sort of argued that the Elizabethan theater was, Shakespeare's theater was going out of its way to say, hey, we're harmless. We're just fun. Don't censor us. Don't look over here. We're just goofing around. But you're suggesting now that sort of the accumulative work that was done in the theater, that sort of cognitive work, that sort of pageantry of history, ended up having a profound impact upon society by creating this sort of informed general public. So it was unintentionally, it ended up creating a revolution.
I think that's so smart.
Well, it's you. You're the smart one.
I think you're right. I think that, I made the case that the theater was powerless because I think that the new historicists like Stephen Greenblatt and Louis Montrose, that they were pushing a kind of under-analyzed, under-theorized version of Foucault as a way of thinking about the theater as an instrument of power. And I wanted to say that's both under-theorized and it's under-historicized. And if you think about things with a little bit more theoretical sophistication, and especially if you think about the history and you look at the archive, you can see that, and Richard II is a great example, that the Queen and the Privy Council went, yeah, they're just players. In fact, they were back playing at court on the very day that the Queen signed the warrant for the execution of Essex.
We should probably just stop and explain to people who might not be familiar with the
Sure.
history that the Earl of Essex, William Devereux, was this good-looking dum-dum of a courtier who tried to have this ill-fated rebellion against the Queen or the people around the Queen, and he paid Shakespeare's troops to put on Richard II, a play they hadn't played in years, perhaps because it depicts the deposition of a king. And then they went on the streets to try to start this rebellion, and everyone just looked at them and laughed, and they were arrested, and Essex was killed. And I mean,
That's right.
Shakespeare's troupe just put on the play because they got paid.
They got paid,
Yeah,
they're just working guys.
yeah, yeah. So
That's
that's the
absolutely.
backstory.
So, and I think what you're saying is really right. And I think you used the word cognitive, that cognitive change. I think that's really smart and really important, that people who spend time in Shakespeare's theater, in Shakespeare's time, they're beginning to think differently about the world in which they're living. They're beginning to think that maybe they should have a voice and a vote, though that's a very long time in coming.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
But they're getting a voice and a vote in the playhouse. And Shakespeare thematizes that in a play like Coriolanus, where the plebs, they have to give their approval to Coriolanus, but they don't actually have any power. And Shakespeare seems to be asking his audience to think hard about where they are in the constitution of the English state. And it's there in Henry VIII also, a play that I'm going to be teaching in a little while, with a play he wrote with John Fletcher, where he's thinking very much about the commoners and the commoners' role in the constitution of the state. So there's some really interesting, creative, political thinking, but I think you're right. It's not about a kind of political program, because he's a playwright, not a politician or a policy wonk. It's about engineering cognitive change, teaching people to think and feel differently about the world they're living in, and to look at somebody who's of a different color or a different religion or of a different sex or of a different sexuality. Stop. Don't put them in a box. Look them in the face. See them as another human being. And he does that all the way through his career, from Kate at the beginning to Caliban at the end.
And it's interesting, we talk about this idea then that Shakespeare is creating this public that becomes over time more and more informed. They convert from sort of just a passive audience watching, this for a couple of laughs, to by the time we get to a play like Henry VIII, which is so political and so engaged, that they're thinking at different levels. So there has been this conversion taking place in the theater. And
That's
you have
right.
called in your big project on conversion, you basically talked about the 16th century as the age of conversion.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just talk what you mean by that, and
Sure.
how that
Absolutely.
applies to Shakespeare.
Well, first of all, we did call it the age of conversion provocatively. Colleagues who work on late antiquity said, wait a
Yeah,
minute.
we're the conversion guys. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the project drew together a team of scholars from, 4 or 5 continents, from different disciplines, different national histories. We also worked with artists, theatrical artists and writers. And we wanted to think about Shakespeare's time. And of course, it wasn't just Shakespeare. We were thinking about early modern science. We were thinking about art. We were thinking about music. We were certainly thinking about the history of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And we were trying to understand how what was going on in that period from, say, maybe 1492 is a good start date, because it's the fall of Granada and the culmination of the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, the conversion of Spain from a mixed religion state to a Catholic state. The forced conversion of the Jews and Muslims, the exile of the Jews and Muslims. And then, of course, it leads then in the early 16th century to the Protestant Reformation. And of course, 1492 is also the year that sees Columbus discover, to use that old word,
Mm-hmm.
the Americas and the forced conversion and cultural genocide going on in the Americas. And we wanted to understand how conversion was weaponized by power, but we also wanted to understand how it became an extraordinarily powerful instrument of resistance to power. And I think that we made a lot of progress. We've got two books. We've got two books out from the project, lots and lots of publications, an opera in progress based on Much Ado About Nothing, and several books that will be forthcoming and are in progress. And I think that I certainly learned a lot from my colleagues in the project. And finally, then Shakespeare started to talk to me. This was an interesting thing. And it's something that I've discovered with Shakespeare. For the first 18 months of the project, Shakespeare wouldn't talk to me about conversion at all. And I just felt I was running the project, so I had lots to do, but I had nothing to say. And then I was in Stratford in Ontario. I was going to do a thing about Taming the Shrew. And so I'm up 5 a.m. because I'm nervous, reading the play. And I suddenly realized Taming the Shrew is a conversion play. And Shakespeare has been kind of signaling me from the top of his mountain, from the upper floor of my house for 18 months. And I've been too stupid to pay attention to what he's been saying. And I suddenly realized he's writing about conversion from the beginning to the end of his career. And he's doing it in a whole range of different ways. And in some ways, one of the things that I've said about him is that Oprah Winfrey is the modern queen of conversion, who monetizes conversion. And she's part of the personal transformation industry that is one of the features of the 21st century. And Shakespeare is the king of conversion. He also monetizes it. He turns it into theater. And he's a very interesting figure in this history because he's also skeptical about conversion. He also wants to test the claims that people make about the changes that they undergo. Prince Hal in the Henry IV plays begins with a soliloquy where he says, ladies and gentlemen, what you're going to see is me converting. He actually uses the word reformation. And I will emerge from this kind of horrible juvenile delinquent that I am now, and you will see me as a true prince, a shining sun. And of course, what Shakespeare cultivates through the whole of these two plays is this huge question. Is this guy really changing? Or is this some kind of massive royal public relations campaign? And so Shakespeare's constantly testing, constantly bringing forward questions about conversion, how conversion can be used by people in power as a form of public relations, as a way of controlling others, how it's used by men in Taming of the Shrew to control their wives, how their wives then can use conversion as a way to push back against men. For example, in The Winter's Tale, toward the end of his career, where the women staged this extraordinary conversion from stone to living warm flesh as a way of controlling and taming and civilizing a man who went ballistic with groundless jealousy against his wife. So Shakespeare's kind of this brilliant conversion artist, but it took me 18 months to finally kind of open my stupid, slow ears to what he'd been trying to tell me since we started that project.
Wow, this is an interesting way of thinking of the plays. And as soon as you said that, I mean, a whole bunch of other, conversion things sort of pop up in my mind, and think of the conversion that is imposed on so many of Shakespeare's characters, imposed or by love.
Yes.
How Benedict has to stop being one of the boys and grow up, right? For the love of Beatrice.
Yes.
And we could think, that's probably one of Shakespeare's biggest themes, is the conversion that love brings.
Yeah.
And it's usually in an unexpected way, or it's in a non-traditional way. People have read their Petrarch and they've read their, the old sonnets, and they think that's love, but no, they're going to be converted in a way they didn't expect.
Yes. It's in that play, of course, where Benedict has a soliloquy where he says, may I be so converted and see with these eyes, because he's thinking about his friend Claudio, who's moved from being a soldier to being a lover. And can he move from being a soldier to being a lover? Yeah. But there's something that is so amazing about this. And Shakespeare brings together religious conversion and love conversion. And in that play, Beatrice and Benedict they're just so beautiful, but they're scared of each other. They want to be seen by each other, but they're frightened that they will be seen by each other, because Benedict is afraid that Beatrice will look at him, he'll open himself to her, and she'll go, nah, I don't like this. And he will be absolutely crushed by that.
Oh, the male ego.
Feels just the same. She feels just the same. So they dance around each other, they poke at each other, they stab at each other. Finally, at the end of the play, they're kind of ready to open up to each other so as to be visible and to be seen by each other. But it has to do with this principle that is deeply religious. It's only when God sees me that I know I exist. And that takes us back to St. Augustine. But of course, the danger there is that I want to exist. I want God to see me, but God knows me through and through. He knows all of my faults. And what happens if I open myself to him? I can't help but open myself to him, and I see him seeing me. He may despise me, and I will be killed by that. So Shakespeare brings together, in Donne's wonderful poem, 1613, Riding Westward, he wants to look at the crucified Christ, but he goes, I can't do it. I can't turn. And finally, he says to the Christ behind him, he says, beat me until you burn the rusts off me, and then I will turn and see your face. So Shakespeare blends together that deep history of the kind of looking relationship with God, since seeing God and being seen by God can be fatal, and thinking about what it is to be seen by another, fully seen by another human being, which is both an existential requirement. We need it to be alive, but also an existential threat. If that person looks at us, we go, look at me, I unfooled myself. And the other person goes, nah, I don't think so. Then it will be terrible.
Yeah. Let's get a little lighter here in terms of conversion and think of something like Bottom's translation.
Yes.
Which is the most visual conversion we have, I think, in Shakespeare. And then how they, it's a different use of the word, how they convert what has happened to them in the woods into drama.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, Bottom is a wonderful, wonderful case study of conversion. The word translation is used about him by Peter Quince.
Our art translated.
Bless thee, Bottom, bless thee, thou art translated. And the word translation is so interesting because it's used in the Geneva Bible about Enoch, who doesn't die. God takes him up, and the Geneva Bible actually says Enoch was translated because God so loved him and did not experience death. So it's about this condition of being blessed by the love of God. And one of the things I love about this play, Midsummer Night's Dream, and what happens to Bottom, is it's part of Shakespeare's defense of the animals. At the end of the play, when Bottom wakes up, he says, and I don't remember exactly what he says, is, he mushes up the Bible, and he says, man is but
hath not seen. That's right.
That's right. And he says, man has not seen. Only an ass could see this.
Right.
Man is but an ass if he says he could see this. And it's as if the animal has access to the beatific vision, to the vision of the divine, not the human. And of course, there's a whole other story there about Shakespeare and the animals, and how he is one of the early advocates to recognize the dignity and creatureliness of the other creatures, of the other animals.
Okay, this is getting a little personal here. As someone who has a puppy in the house, I'm sure it's upstairs whining right now. Someone posted on sort of Facebook, said, I've gone through Shakespeare and all Shakespeare's references to dogs are negative. Did Shakespeare hate dogs? And you're thinking Shakespeare was an animal lover.
Mostly he did hate dogs, but it wasn't the dogs that he hated so much as what people had done to the dogs. Because our dogs are really sweet, but dogs are these wonderful kinds of creatures that are made by human culture.
Mm-hmm.
And in Shakespeare's time, many of the dogs were guard dogs. They were attack dogs. The Spanish used dogs against the indigenous people of the Americas to hunt them down and kill them.
Mm-hmm.
So
And they were used in
Shakespeare's
sport, bear baiting, sicked on
absolutely,
bears, so they were
yeah.
trained to kill.
So Shakespeare, I don't know that Shakespeare had a dog. Leon Rook wrote a lovely book about
Yes.
Shakespeare's dog.
Yeah.
It's true. It's true. He doesn't have much good to say about dogs. Um,
But you think he was an animal
and it's over
advocate?
and over again.
But you think he was an animal advocate? That's interesting.
But one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is how Shylock is a dog man. The word dog and its cognates are used over and over again in reference to Shylock. And at the end of the play, Shylock speaks to the court, not the end, but in the trial scene, speaks to the court in the language of the Cynic philosophers, right?
Right.
The Cynic philosophers, the word cynic means dog.
Right.
He actually takes on the vicious dogginess that he threatened Antonio with earlier in the play. And I think there's a point where we could say he's on the dog side.
Okay.
But you're right. You're right. In general, he's not a friend of our friends, the dogs.
Yeah, I mean, I've sometimes argued that Shakespeare's references to animals and vegetation and gardening and stuff like that is just proof that he was a country boy.
Yeah, I think that's right. He spent time with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So is there anything else in the last few minutes before we bring Mary back to see if there are any questions from the viewers about Shakespeare and Canada? Again, I want to, again, because you're the only Canadian scholar that we've talked to,
Sure.
that you think there's a special relevance, or Shakespeare can be made particularly relevant to Canadian concerns at this moment.
I think absolutely. Since his art is vitally alive, it's vitally alive in Canada as well. And, in Quebec, for example, and my friend Jen Druin has written brilliantly about this, of all people, Shakespeare's been taken up by sovereigntists against English Canada.
What?
So that during the Quiet Revolution, there was a play that was put on called Hamlet, Prince du Québec, which was this brilliant allegory where Hamlet is Quebec and struggling to be free and struggling to bring justice to the world in which he lives. So in Quebec, Shakespeare's been taken up by First Nations artists. Shakespeare's been very important. There was a brilliant production of Julius Caesar several years back, an Indigenous production that used it to think through social hierarchy, about the big man theory of history and the big man theory of political community. My friend and colleague, you were our friend and colleague, Jessica Hill, has recently written a play called The Dark Lady, where she's rethinking the sonnets in relationship to a Black woman with whom Shakespeare seems to have been in love, or was just imagining that he was in love in the sonnets. So I think that Shakespeare's work has a lot to give us, has given us a lot, and still has a very great deal to give us. But of course, one of the great things about Shakespeare is that he's free. There's no copyright.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's great for the theater. And there's no one to interfere with how you do him. You do him any way you want. And people have been doing that for many, many years. He is the most generative artist in the history of the world. I think that is true. I don't think any other artist has produced, he hasn't produced, but has been productive of so many millions of other works of art. And I only know the Tempest best, and the several hundred, maybe tens of thousands of works of art that have spun off from the Tempest.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And this question of Quebec, you haven't a chance yet to see Done and Undone, but it
Yeah.
ends with a scene in Quebec, and
Oh, cool.
these Quebecers talking, in French about, well, what do we do with this Shakespeare guy? Well, we're going to modify him in a million ways, and I think it comes back to a point you're sort of making. You can't break Shakespeare. You can manipulate him any way you want, play with him,
Mhm.
recreate him, reinvent him. It's not going to break Shakespeare. He's still going to be there for us to explore in different, new, and exciting ways.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's right. But it's a long conversation that we're having.
Yeah. Well, let's call Mary back to see if we have questions from our audience. Hey, Mary.
Hello, hello. So Brenda has a question for you. Can or does conversion intersect with abuse in Shakespeare? Whether it does or not, is abuse normalized, or only in the present is it seen more as damaging rather than taming slash compliance dash inducing slash converting?
That is a fabulous, difficult question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that again, it's a really good question because there's no easy answer to it. It's going to be case by case. I think take Taming of the Shrew, for example, because there's a whole bunch of abuse in that play. And for some years, there were many feminist scholars who wanted to declare a moratorium on it. And I and others were people who very gingerly entered into conversation with that position and said, yes and no, yes and no. It's important just to keep the conversation going. But there is abuse in that play. Is the abuse normalized? Is the question. I think it is not. I think it is not. Now, I think also that it will depend so much on how the play is read and how it is performed. But I do think there is a soliloquy right in the middle of that play where Petruchio himself, who is the torturer in chief, the tamer in chief, says to the audience, is directly to the audience, if anyone knows another way to tame a shrew, please let me know. He says, 'tis charity to show. And charity, of course, is the word for Christian love. And then, of course, the soliloquy at the end is this bringing forward of a person who is a person, not a shrew who has been tamed. And I think that sometimes, my students will say, well, in Shakespeare's time, it was just taken at face value. And I think, I can't say that that's not true. After all, the part was not played by a woman, it was played by a boy. But I think that the play as a whole invites us to push back against the normalization of abuse that is an extremely important part of the conversional process in that play. But again, I think the question is a really important question.
Mm-hmm. What about the conversion of Shylock, the forced conversion at the end? That's the most brutal one in Shakespeare, surely.
And again, for me, the thing that makes Shakespeare so valuable is not that he belongs to a kind of a sphere of transcendent goodness and clear sight. He's deeply embedded in his own culture, which is a misogynist culture, a patriarchal culture, an anti-Semitic culture. And the misogyny and the anti-Semitism is there in the plays. Just as that, your question is absolutely right, Paul. And I think that's why it's so important, because those things are not things we've left behind. They're things that we're still living with. And Shakespeare was living with them, and his plays engage those things without kind of pushing them aside. They're integral to the plays, but putting them in question. Because after all, Shakespeare is an artist. He's not a policy person. He's not a political writer. He's creating works of art. And the thing about works of art is they bring together very, very different kinds of language. Thinking about the kind of multifaceted languages in Shakespeare's plays, that means that there are different ways of seeing, different ways of thinking, different ways of speaking, all together jostling against each other, contesting against each other in the same play. That's key to the reason you stay in conversation with him. It's not because he's nice. There's a lot in Shakespeare that is not nice. But there's a lot in the 21st century that's not nice. In fact, boy, the last 18 months have really brought home to a lot of us just how far we're living in a historical period that is not particularly nice. So Shakespeare is here with us. Um, you know, one of the things we concluded when we were working on Richard III is that he must have had a time machine, came forward to 2021 and went, "Oh, I'm going back and I'm going to write a play about what they're living in now."
Funny. Other questions, Mary?
Jody has a question regarding your comments about Shakespeare as a country boy and his attitude to the animal world. She wonders, or Jody wonders, if you have any comment about Maggie O'Farrell's book, Hamnet and Judith.
Lovely. Do you want to take that, Paul?
I loved that book. I absolutely loved it. The invention of Anne Hathaway as this sort of wise woman who was absolutely traumatized by the death of their son Hamnet, and who really doesn't quite get what Shakespeare is doing in London. I don't want to give away the end of the book if you haven't read it, but eventually she goes to the theater, and there's this sort of revelatory moment at the end of the book, which I found heartbreaking. So I thought it was just an incredibly imaginative way of doing it. And one of the interesting things is she makes a conscious decision never to call Shakespeare by his name. So it's always like him, the husband, right? So he's this a bit of a cipher in a way. So our attention is on Anne Hathaway, who has historically, been, you go back to romantic critics and stuff like that, they all dismissed her. Oh, he must have seduced the young Shakespeare. Obviously, he ran away from her, and that's why he spent all his time in London. And she was this, weight around his neck that was weighing him down, right? And Farrell just reverses that entirely. I loved the novel.
I love the novel as well, and I love what you just said about it. And I think that one of the things that Shakespeare says in The Tempest is that they're joking about this old guy Gonzalo, and they say he's going to carry this island home in his pocket and give it to his son as an apple, and dropping the seeds in the ocean bring forth more islands. And this is a wonderful kind of image of Shakespeare's generativeness. And the novel of Hamlet is a splendid example of the way a great modern writer can engage with Shakespeare's story. And, I'm never going to read Hamlet the same way. Mm-hmm. And James Joyce also had thoughts about Hamlet. How could he not have been thinking about his son Hamlet? Mm-hmm. Because the name Hamlet and name Hamlet are more or less interchangeable, mm-hmm. by my understanding. About Shakespeare as a country boy, mm-hmm. He knows animals. But the thing about living in London in Shakespeare's time, people who lived in London, it wasn't like modern London. There were animals in London. So anybody who lived anywhere in Shakespeare's time was hanging out with the animals, with sheep, with goats, with chickens, yeah. And so on. And so I think he's also reading Montaigne, and he's reading the Apology for Raymond Sebond, which is one of the great early defenses of the animals and a great attack on human exceptionalism. And that gets into Shakespeare's drama as well. That's another story altogether.
I have a question for you both. And that is, when you are, or if you don't teach introductory Shakespeare courses for undergraduates, regardless, what big ideas do you like to start with, or would you like people to encounter when they're first encountering Shakespeare? Like, what's important to you as you introduce Shakespeare to people?
For me, just what I've been talking about with Paul, and that is to keep in the conversation, because I don't want to pretend that Shakespeare's nice and embodies this kind of sanitized version of 21st century enlightenment. I don't think it's true about us now, and I don't think it's true about Shakespeare. So I talk about living in a house with this guy who says things that I can't believe he said, and then we just start talking, and we talk it through. And you know, in the course that I'm teaching now, which is a 300 level course. So, you know, it's a big course with a lot of people in it. They're really smart. They're so happy to be back together with other young people. We're all masked, but we're there in the room together. And our first play was Titus Andronicus. And we spent a lot of time talking about honor killing, about rape and the mutilation and violence against women. We talked about racism. We talked about the problems. You're not going to shy away from these things. It would be a betrayal of the art to pretend that he's nice. He's not nice. He never was nice. And I think it's so important to bear that in mind. And so he really is, you know, as Paul said at the beginning, he's someone who still is tremendously valuable for us now. But we have to play the problems. We have to confront the problems.
I would say, I mean, there is so much in Shakespeare that I tend to, when I'm teaching a Shakespeare course, organize around some big idea. I'll choose an idea, Shakespeare in love, Shakespeare in politics, Shakespeare and affect or something. It's just because there's so much. So right now I'm teaching a course in literature in war, fourth year seminar, small class, intense class. And we did the Iliad, now we're doing Henry V. And we're looking at things, like Paul says, the nasty bits, like the enthusiasm that Shakespeare shows there for what's going on in Ireland, where there's England was constantly trying to suppress Ireland in the 16th century, and Shakespeare celebrates it. One of his choruses mentions the Earl of Essex, right? That great general who's over there kicking Irish butt. And so, this is jingoism, right? It's not pretty, however much he may complicate the representation of war. There is this sort of, come on, sell the field to buy the sword and get out there. And there's still a lot of that in the world, as Paul mentions. This is a conversation still going on today. So yeah, so it depends on which play I'm teaching and how I've organized the course.
I love that you brought the Iliad to the students.
Oh yeah. Oh wow.
Oh my God, I was reading it at the table on my iPad. I'll just say this in a second. And my wife looked over and she said to me, we're having breakfast. She said, "You're crying. Why are you crying?" And I said, it's Priam. He's gone to ask Achilles for his son's body back.
Yeah.
And she said, "What?" I said, "Oh, I can't begin to explain it to you."
Heartbreaking scene.
Yeah.
So it's 12 o'clock now. So we're going to have to wrap up. And I just really want to thank Paul for agreeing to do this. It's great to see you again, Paul. Hopefully one of these days we'll see each other in person at a conference, or you'll come out to Vancouver and come to Bard on the Beach and hang out. And thank you, Mary, for organizing this series of interviews and organizing Bard Explored once again this year. And hopefully next year we'll be back in the tent.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, Ava. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone who has attended. This will bring our Bard Explored series to a close, but the recordings will be accessible both on Bard on the Beach's YouTube channel and also on the webpage for Bard Explored, which you can find at bardonthebeach.org. Also, if you haven't had enough engagement, Bard education goes throughout the year, and we are in the midst of our Speech of the Week series, and there are different ways that you can participate in that. You can just listen to the webinars that I run with our guest artists. You can engage with a speech yourself in our interactive working sessions, and you can even record your own version of these wonderful speeches, share them with us, and we will put them together in a compilation to share with the world. I am so grateful to everyone for all of these amazing opportunities to connect with one another and to do what we do, which is inspire community. So thank you all so much. Until next time, farewell.
Thank you. Thank you.